Ladies, gentlemen, am I often forgotten, but certainly not by me. Seismic Singularities, welcome to the channel, and welcome to my RuneScape 3 DPS guide, Magic Edition. This guide is going to be focusing on how I personally approach Magic DPS, and it's going to cover a few different topics. Mainly, it's going to cover how I would do magic damage without any type of FSOA spec, so anything from, honestly, the beginning weapons all the way up till FSOA, my methods for how I use FSOA, and it'll also cover ticking and a couple other ideas. And don't worry, I will cover weapon camping as well. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this guide. Alrighty, so to keep this with the same format as the Melee DPS guide, this is going to be a live format style video or guide, and we're going to start off with the gear that I am using. So as far as gear is concerned, as far as I can tell, this is best in slot, bar some very extremely minor increases, being that my corroming and my lunging could technically be T92 dyed switches. However, the DPS increase on those, I believe, is quite literally like 0.01% or 0.05%, so it's not something I'm willing to spend the GP on. As far as EOFs are concerned, G-Staff EOF is a huge component, and it will carry you all the way from basically like level 70 weapons all the way up until you have FSOA, and I still use it. Obviously, it's a really good spec to have. However, I would add the second EOF in when you get an FSOA, just because ABS is a very nice spec. It has 5 hits, all of them can crit, which synergizes very nicely with FSOA spec. Speaking of things that I would use without FSOA, so say I'm just on T92 or T90 gear, Scripture of When is very nice. It is kind of a buy once, cry once mentality, being that I believe they're anywhere from 100 to 150 mil. I honestly forget the prices of these a lot. However, once you buy it, the upkeep cost on it is dirt cheap. So I would use something like this until I get FSOA, and then I would, once I have this staff, then I would use Grim just to make the staff more worthwhile to use. As far as defenders and shields and whatnot go, my T81's just a planted feat. This one is E4R3. That's kind of a Telos thing. It's the only place I really use my T90 defender, being that I have a clear-headed 4 Turt Force switch, and this gives me a 13-second Cade on defender while still being able to dish out quite a bit of damage. And then these are just perked according to the best in slot perks on the wiki. This Singularity is a corroming switch. Corroming synergizes very nicely with Greater Chain, and lunging switch largely is useless. However, a lot of the places I go have static targets, and it just makes Combust a little bit nicer to use, being that if a static target, it's static, you can't walk it to get the 2x multiplier, so it just makes Combust a little bit more nice to use if you have to use that basic in a pinch. Other than that, Cinderbanes, very important for places that allow weapon poison. However, if you don't, Carapac wrist wraps are a nice option. And kind of the elephant in the room being that I have 2 different armor sets, one dyed, one undyed. The dyed one is the one I started out with. I used this one for a long time, and I had kind of a hodgepodge mishmash of random perks on here for the longest time, being that I was doing a lot of elite dungeons, so I had the perks like Dragon Slayer, Genocidal, and Undead Slayer on here. And then when I went to other places, I would kind of take them off and put on something else in its place. I usually would do the... I didn't have Impatient back then because it wasn't really worthwhile. This was pre-FSOA. And I just had Genocidal Undead or Genocidal Dragon Slayer, and I would pull that off and put it on when I needed it. This one just has standard perks. This is largely overkill, and you could use much less of armor for something to hold a Slayer perk. Like, you could just use T90 or even T88 or something like that, and you won't notice too much of a DPS difference. However, I was a bit extra and just bought an extra armor set. However, that's pretty much everything with all of my gear. I do have 3 rune pouches, the grasping pouches that hold 4 each, and I just followed the EVME setup for that. There's nothing special there, and it holds all the runes for everything I need to do spell-wise. So now that that long-winded discussion about the gear that I have is over and done with, let's go ahead and start talking about the abilities that I actually use when doing magic. Much like in the melee DPS guide, if you haven't checked that out, there will be a link in the description, or you can just go on my channel and find it. Magic is broken up just like that, just like the other combat styles, into 3 types of abilities: basic, threshold, and ultimate. And as far as basic abilities are concerned with magic, your main one is going to be Concentrated Blast, or when you can upgrade it, Greater Concentrated Blast. This is the strongest basic ability by far as magic goes, and being that it has a 5-second cooldown, you can use this every 3rd ability. So it's definitely advantageous to get G-Conk as soon as possible, and you will love life afterwards. So typically what I do is I will use G-Conk and then something like D-Breath with Corrupt, another G-Conk, and kind of just rotate through. And I will try to make the bleeds that I have the 3rd ability in that little 3-block ability rotation for basics. So since G-Conk has a crit buffing effect, and bleeds or burns can't take advantage of the crit buff, I try and put things like Dragon Breath or Impact with a Flank or something like even Rack or something like that after a G-Conk. However, specifically with Rack, I save that for ice racking. Most of the places I go allow stuns or binds to be in effect, so Rack becomes the same strength as Dragon Breath. So I honestly don't go to many places where that can't happen, so it's where I've based kind of my basic rotation off of. Also, as far as two-hand is concerned, my bar is exactly the same, except for Magma Tempest, which honestly, it's not really worth the cost that it is. I would say this is definitely a later upgrade. However, I do have it, so I tossed it on my bar. And Sonic Wave is the same style of ability. It's the two-hand variant of G-Conk, being that it's 5-second cooldown and you can use it every 3rd ability. So if you're staff camping, you would use this every 3rd ability. If you're dual wield camping, you would use Greater Conk every 3rd ability, and kind of just mix in abilities as you go. I would recommend, though, to avoid staff camping, because G-Conk is just that much stronger than Sonic Wave. However, Sonic Wave is nice to throw in before something like, say, way back when it was used to just before Debilitate, because the effect that it has is it grants extra accuracy on the next ability used. So if you're at a place where something has extremely high defense, this can be advantageous for getting things off, like a threshold or an ultimate or something, or another ability, or something you really need to hit the target. The last basic that I'm going to cover is Chain, or its bigger cousin, Greater Chain. Chain is a kind of nice ability if you're dealing with any type of AoE, the standard Chain anyways, being that if you can have it hit 2 other targets, it'll hit the main target and then search for other targets in the area and then hit those accordingly, so it's technically a 300% damage ability, being that 3 100% hits are going out, and it's kind of confusing, but it's not bad for AoE type places. If you're doing something like any of the elite dungeons, or you're dealing with minions at Art Glacier, or any of those types of places. Now, Greater Chain, what it can do is it'll hit all the targets just like Chain does, and I'm pretty sure, yeah, it does the same exact damage as Chain. However, the next ability you use will also be applied to all of the targets that Chain has hit. So It's very strong in combination with something like Kuroming 4, being that you can hit up to 6 targets. And afterwards, you could toss in something like Omni Power or Wild Magic or Fix or anything, and that target that you're attacking, it'll apply to all of them around you. However, there is a caveat with this ability being that the secondary targets will not be affected at full damage. It will be at half damage. However, as far as AoE specific damage is concerned, this one is the absolute best. So a topic I need to cover in some decent detail before we move on to ability rotations and other things that I use when doing magic damage is the idea of four-ticking, which in very simple terms, without getting too technical about what's actually happening in the tick system, is you do a dual wield ability, you equip your staff during global cooldown, which global cooldown is, you see these abilities, like you can't just spam abilities every single tick, you have to wait 3 ticks in order to do another ability. So during that global cooldown, you swap to a staff and then hit your auto keybind in combination with another ability. So you do that, wait for the flash of the abilities, and then you would hit the auto keybind. So it would look something like this. And then go ahead afterwards and rinse and repeat. Four-ticking is not its own ability rotation, but more something like a tool in which you add into any other ability rotation to then add more damage to it, if that makes sense. Now, the reason that this works is every weapon in game has a specific attack speed. You'll see here it says speed fastest, the third line down on the information of the weapon you're looking at. And for a staff, it's average, being that this will force auto attacks out. I believe it's every 2.4 seconds, so that's 4 ticks, and then these are 3.6, so it'd be 5 ticks. And the weird correlation between weapon speeds is when you're switching weapons, for the first auto attack, it uses the previous weapon's speed. So the best example of this in simple terms is in old school or in pre-EOC PvP, there was something known as a prod weapon, being that you could be attacking with a whip, which was a fastest or a fast weapon, and then on the right tick of when the whip would auto again, you would just pull out like a sword or something like a god sword and just smack your target for a lot more damage. However, when you went back to your whip, then it would use the auto attack speed of the two-hander, so it would take you a little while before you got back up to speed of smacking your target with a whip. For some reason, that interaction is in game, and we can take advantage of that, being that keybinded auto attacks force out autos 1 tick earlier than usual. So if that was a confusing mess, I apologize. However, once again, the simple thing that I'm doing here is I hit a dual ability. During the cooldown, I swap, I wait for the glow, and then I press auto with an ability, then swap back to my staff. And I'm using thumb buttons here to control my weapon switches. Also, one more quick note, this this method of four-ticking also assumes you're on full manual. There is a way to four-tick, I believe, with Revo. However, it's very odd and clunky, being I'm pretty sure it uses queuing up a auto attack, so ability queuing is used, which already has its kind of own sets of quirks and features with it to be nice, and it involves queuing the auto attack and doing some other things, and I honestly am not really sure how four-tick on Revo works. However, I find once you learn full manual and you're used to pressing your own keybinds, incorporating a key that is close to your other abilities, being that G and B, if you look up on the upper left, G and B are my 2 auto keys, and I'm usually using G, and then Q through R, A through F, and Z through V. They're all my main abilities. So I can easily just use my pointer finger and my pinky, or my ring finger, or my middle finger, to then hit different keys that I need to in a sort of key roll fashion, and it's a very simple technique for me. So the one thing I forgot to include here is the overarching reason on why you would want to include staff autos in a rotation anyways, being that you can just press abilities faster. So with Fortic forcing out a staff auto every other ability, staff autos hit a lot harder, being that there is no offhand weapon with them to add up to make the total damage for the tier level of weapon. So if you notice here, if I just spam auto attacks, there's two autos coming out. One's coming from the main hand and one's coming from the offhand. This adds together to be what the same damage would be from a staff, because it's one hit and you're doing it less often, but they work out to be roughly the same damage output, you know, with a few minor caveats in there. However, waiting one tick afterwards, after every other ability, it works out over time to be a lot more damage than just spamming abilities in the first place. So hopefully I didn't lose too many of y'all there. I know it can be kind of a confusing subject. However, if you just practice it and keep at it, you'll have that point in time where you're just like, oh, it makes sense now. Because for me, I was trying to learn it for the longest time. It took me like a week or two to like grasp the concept of how it worked. And once I finished learning it and understood it, it started teaching me so much more about the combat system, and I'm very thankful that I actually went ahead and learned this method of adding damage into a magic rotation. Real fast, I wanted to cover the relics I generally use with magic. So a staple of magic for me, regardless of whether if I had FSOA or not, would be COE or Conservation of Energy. Saving 10% on Sunshine and Omni Power it's very, very helpful for getting rotations off, being that if you want to use Omni as your third ability, you would Vigor and have this Relic active, and you can make it your third, thus getting the 2 Omni Powers off per Sunshine. Assuming no FSOA, however, that's bit of a different story. Fury of the Small, I will most of the time have in here with Death Ward, and that's kind of a general purpose setup, like if I'm setting at Glacier or something like that, or maybe I'm at Carapac hard mode, this is something I would use. Other things that you can do is if you don't have mobile on your gear, switch to Shadow's Grace in the 3rd slot, and then go ahead and put Berserker's Fury in the 1st slot. This is dependent on if you're at a place where lowering your HP is feasible. Some places you either are full HP, and if you're half you get comboed, other places not so much. So just kind of play that off of where you're at specifically. And also, if you're like me and you're deathly afraid of getting a cheese and tomato bata inside of an elite dungeon, I know this isn't damage related, I will run Luck of the Dwarves in the 1st slot with either Shadow's Grace or Font of Life, depending on which armor set I'm using. That's not a recommended thing as far as doing a lot of damage. However, that's more of just a out of fear thing. The big one, though, is having Conservation of Energy. For sure. This is the main staple of having good magic damage. Alrighty, we can finally go ahead and get into the rotations that I use for magic. Now, with magic, there is no in-between spec that we have to really take into consideration. Everything for magic is done during the Sunshine, or in some very niche uses, Metamorph. However, Sunshine is going to be your best friend for this combat style, and most of the damage output from this style comes from your time inside of Sunshine. Now, just like other ultimates like Death Swiftness or Berserk, it has a 1-minute cooldown. However, Sunshine lasts on its own for 30 seconds normally. If you use Planted Feet as a switch, then you can start a sun and get the 37-second Sunshine, so it's an extra 7 seconds.
And when you go back to your normal weapons that don't have planted feet on it, you don't have the reduction in Sun's effectiveness. So you just are basically getting a free 7 seconds of Sunshine to crank out more damage for free just by using a planted feet swap. Now, typically for a Sun, without FSOA Spec, my main goal would be to get 2 Omni powers, assuming you have the Mage or the hybrid version of the Zuck Cape, because this ability only uses 60% Adrenaline, and if you use Vigor, or if you use COE or Conservation of Energy, that can bring the cost down of this ability even more to 50 or even 40% Adrenaline, and 2 of these per Sunshine is a lot of damage. I would then look to including 2 Wild Magics and potentially 2 Asphyxes. I'm not sure if you can get 2 Asphyxes with Omni Power. If you get lucky with Impatient procs, I think you can. However, it's been so long since I've done a magic rotation with this. I can't remember if you can get the second Asphyx out. However, 1 Asphyx with a Detonate using the Blast Diffusion boots will be more than enough damage in most use cases. Also, in order to help you get Adrenaline, you could use Insight Fear to boost Tsunami at some point and get the extra Adren. However, in order to get 2 Omni powers out, you pretty much have to Sun a pot immediately and then do 2 basics without any sort of four-ticking or anything like that, and then get the Omni power off. So an example of a Sunshine rotation without FSOA would look something like this. Now, I will be tossing 4-tick autos here and there. However, the principle, if you don't want a 4-tick, is the same, being that I'm focusing on 2 Omnis, 2 Wild Magics, a Dedo, and an Asphyx, and potentially a Tsunami. However, me getting Tsunami in is kind of a it's kind of an improv thing. I don't have a absolute set in stone rotation. But anyways, it would look something like this. I'll go ahead and grab targets. Start my Sunshine off. Double ability. Get my Vig ready. Omni power. I'll go ahead and 4-tick into a conch. Clear that out. Get the auto for this Tsunami. 4-tick into an Asphyx. Hit a deep breath afterwards. Go for a Dedo. Maybe go for something like a Deep Impact with a release. 4-tick into a deep breath. Oh, I should have hit Omni there. I wasn't paying attention. But in general, that's what some type of Sun without FSOA rotation would look like. Instead of hitting that deep breath on the last ability, I definitely should have hit Omni power, but I just had a kind of a lapse of focus. That happens from time to time. I'm not anywhere near a perfect PVMer. However, you get that second Omni off and practice it inside of the Sun. That is a very strong rotation. Now, with Insight Fear being active all the time, it can eat away at runes. However, if you're not FSOA speccing, you don't really have to worry about it. If you want to spell swap, go for it. However, I'm going to cover spell swapping a little bit later in this video. So where magic really started to come alive as a combat style was the introduction of the staff, Fractured Staff of Armadyl. It was a tier 95 staff with a weapon spec that lasts for 30 seconds, and what happens is when you crit with any ability or any hit, the staff will chuck out an extra auto attack for free. It doesn't reset any type of ability cooldowns or anything like that. It does not allow you to 4-tick. However, just staff camping and spamming abilities under spec is more than enough damage. So the general principles during an FSOA Sun that I follow is I will Sun, D-Breath into G-Conch. Sometimes I'll hit a third ability, excuse me. It's either 2 or 3 basics, depending on, Impatient procs or a couple other things and what my Adren looks like. Or if I've already built up Insight Fear stacks, typically it will only be 2 abilities. And then my third or fourth ability, respectively, would be Tsunami. Tsunami gives a crit buff for 30 seconds. Not a buff to critical hit chance itself, but an effect where every crit you hit will grant you extra adrenaline. I believe it is, 10% extra adrenaline per crit for 30 seconds. It works the same as Incendiary Shot and Meteor Strike, respectively, for the other combat styles. So I'll hit Tsunami, and typically we'll have enough adrenaline after that to go ahead instantly into a staff spec. Now, depending on where I'm at, I will just go ahead and use both Adrenaline Renewal and Limitless Sigil inside of a Sun and immediately go for a Smoke Tendrils. If you're doing something where you have to do multiple Suns in a row, and you're not getting forced off with a boss in any way for a set amount of time or something like that, to where you could natty or do something else, then you could just G-Conk after your staff spec, and more than likely you will build back up to over 50% adrenaline to start Tendrils. Now, Tendrils is an extremely important ability for this rotation, specifically because it crits every single hit that it does. It is a channeled ability that does 4 hits, and every single one of them crits, so it's guaranteed adrenaline for you to gain. And then after that, I will typically hit Wild Magic, or if I'm at like 90 plus adrenaline, I will go ahead and hit Omni Power, and then Wild Magic, but typically I try and go for Wild Magic first. And then after that, I will start weaving my... where is my EOF? It's in the bank. Anyways, I have an Armadyl Battle Staff EOF. I will start weaving that in with other thresholds such as Asphyx and Detonate. I don't honestly use too much inside of FSOA. I don't think anyone really does that. It doesn't seem like it'd be too worthwhile. However, that's something you can do, and in between each ABS spec, being that you can't back-to-back them with a staff equipped because of weapon speed and some other shenanigans in this game, I will weave a basic ability in, or another threshold that comes off cooldown, like maybe Deep Impact if I haven't used it yet, something like that, and just start pumping out the damage until Wild Magic comes back off cooldown. So typically that is my thought process when going through an FSOA spec. Alrighty, so a quick example of how I would do a Sunshine rotation with FSOA spec. So I brought out a Calg Demon just to get the extra crit chance to give a more realistic idea of what this would look like, out and about inside of a PVM scenario. So grab target real quick, and I'll build up my Insight Fear stacks just so, like I would in any other situation, like a previous boss fight where I'm starting a Sun somewhere halfway in a fight, etc, etc. Anyways, without waffling about a bit more, I'll go ahead and start the Sun. A-Pot into a G-Conk D-Breath. I'll go ahead and auto Tsunami here. Into the FSOA spec and immediately put my ring back on, Limitless into a Tendril. Let all of them hit out. For some reason I hit a basic. Now I'm getting a lot of crits, so I'll immediately just Omni. Another basic, and go ahead and start staff specking. Or ABS specking, I should say, into a G-Conk. Get anything there, so I'll G-Conk into Wild Magic and then hit another ABS. That wasn't exactly the best example I could do. I've definitely had much better Suns. However, that's kind of the fun part about Magic, is that it is a now kind of improv-heavy combat style. And also, yes, for those with an eagle eye, I was very late in switching over to Xang. I kind of forgot about that, but it is what it is. But Magic, getting back on topic, it's a very improv-heavy combat style, and it's mostly dependent on the adrenaline that you get back from your crits. So the most stable part of the rotation is the beginning, is building up, getting your Tsunami off, and staff spec off into a tendrils as soon as possible. If you have to save limitless for some time later in the fight that you're doing, then you can simply go ahead and do that and use something like G-Conk and maybe another Dragon Breath or a Rack and Ruin or something like that. You know, any ability just to help get you above 50% to then start your tendrils. Then post tendrils, either Wild Magic or Omni Power is going to be your best friend. And then after that, it starts to kind of be a improv fest. The last example I wanted to give really quick is a niche rotation I use in a couple different places. And this is how I use Metamorphosis. I use this for P4 Solak, P4 Raksha, and I also have used this at ED1 in the past. And also a Stellar, and I have used this. So it is a Metamorph rotation. I should probably have it keybound. That might be helpful. There we go. So what I do for Metamorph is I get my Tsunami and Staff Spec off, and I use APOT to help me quickly build back up Adrenaline. So I'll go ahead and build some stacks here. What I'll do is I'll Tsunami, Auto Tsunami into a Staff Spec, APOT, hit another basic, I'm 100% already, and then start my Metamorph, go directly into a Tendies, Wild Magic, into an Omni Power, and I happen to get enough Adrenaline here where I can just fix afterwards. And hit another ability, and it's done. This is really nice for dishing out an absolute crap ton of burst damage, being that meta is stronger than a Sunshine by about 12.5%. It doesn't last for long, however, if you build up beforehand and use it to burst down damage in a specific encounter, then it's very, very useful in those niche situations. And I just wanted to include that really quickly before I touch on a couple other topics. So the last couple ideas I kind of wanted to toss together here, it's kind of the ancillary bits of magic DPS, however, they are still important enough to talk about, and that is one of them being spell switching. So Insight Fear and Xang both came into game, I believe it was late or mid 2021, late 2021, somewhere around there. They came into game, and they both have some interesting effects, being that Insight Fear cuts down on the adrenaline cost of Tsunami, making it useful for FSOA Specking or just any Sunshine in general. So it's a strong ability that can also help you get more adrenaline to get more thresholds off. Overall, it's very nice. And Xang has the effect where up to 12 stacks, your basic abilities will do up to 12% more damage. So it's a very nice DPS increase, and also at the top stack, it turns Rack into Rack and Ruin, which is a extremely strong basic, able to hit 60 to 300% weapon damage, and if you ice Rack into it, it does 120 to 360. It's extremely strong. It will usually hit anywhere from 8 to 10k. It's really, really strong. I love using this one. And after that, if you use Combust, after using Rack and Ruin, it'll give an additional, I believe, 2 hits to Combust. So if you're using something like Carapac Wrist Wraps or just anywhere in general, the Combust will do more damage and actually be a pretty good ability at that point. So I will usually spell swap between these. I usually will main Xang and then swap to Insight Fear just before I'm about to start Sunshine, so that way I can do G-Conk into D-Breath or D-Breath G-Conk or something like that in order to then make Tsunami my third ability, depending on if I want to sneak auto attacks in or not. As far as the other ones are concerned, Ice Barrage is very nice for freezing targets and causing stun or targets to be stunnable. So Ice Autos are a nice thing to use in combination with Rack, being that Rack, if a target is bound or stunned, it is a 188% ability instead of 94 for as far as ability damage is concerned. And that's why I have it bound on a separate key here. It's just so whenever I want to use Ice Rack, I can just go ahead, hit B and C, which are nice and close to each other. And it makes life very, very nice for me. And it's a lot of extra damage on targets that are stunnable. And then Blood Barrage is nice because it can heal you a lot. Especially under FSOA Spec, there's 2 benefits to using Blood Barrage. If you're somewhere that does a lot of damage to you, like Art Glacor High in Rage, for example, during an FSOA Spec, you can get away with almost no food usage just because blood autos are healing you so much. So it's like the more damage you deal, the more health you gain back, which then allows you to do more damage because you're not trying to chug down brews or other food and stuff. So it's kind of just a compounding effect to make life really nice for you. And blood autos with Blood Barrage come out, I believe, 1 tick faster than Exang or Incite Fear. So that is something that is very niche, but it does have its uses in some very specific scenarios. Now, as far as spell swapping is concerned, something you will want to do with this is go into gameplay settings, action or combat and action bar, and you will want manual spell casting on. So you can set an auto spell, but when you auto attack with other ones such as blood or ice, it doesn't swap your main auto cast over to those spells. So if I'm over here, I use a couple abilities, and I use Blood Barrage with an ability. Notice how it did not shift my auto attack over to Blood Barrage. It's very nice for just keeping everything kind of tidy and organized as far as spells are concerned. Also, if you're trying to build up stacks, auto attacks do not build up the stacks for either of these 2 spells. It is only ability hits. So having them switch off is kind of obnoxious because then you might not notice it. And then you aren't building stacks anymore, wondering why you're having problems and whatnot. The only caveat to manual spellcast is if you click any abilities from a book, like the ability books over here, then you have to then apply it to a target like so. You can't just have a target and then hit like an ability here and spam click it. Even if the ability bar is locked, you can't click it. You have to then click over this way. And that also is the use case for something like Provoke. So just have anything you want on ability bars. If it's locked in an ability bar or unlocked in an ability bar, you can click it without issue. So if you're the type of person who likes to click some abilities, just make sure it's on an action bar and not inside of an ability book, and you will be set for manual spellcasting. Which brings me to the last topic, and that is familiar usage. Now, with archaeology coming out, there's 3 familiars that we use, which is Ripper Demon and Calgarian Demon. So the general usage, I would say, for both of these is if you're using FSOA, you've bought one, you're happy with it, and you're full send in that damage, I would suggest using Calgarian Demon just for the fact that it gives a flat 1% extra crit chance, and then when you use the spec, it's an additional 5% crit chance for 60 seconds. So it's kind of a set and forget type deal. I don't think you can set this to auto cast. You have to manually set it, but it's 1 button press a minute. Just find a keybind that works for you, and you're off to the races. Now, if you're using if you're not using FSOA, say you're on T90 or T92 weapons, or even down like the T80, T85 area, Ripper Demon's probably going to be your best friend, assuming that it works on the boss you're doing. Some bosses like Raxer, the main attack doesn't work, but the passive does work. So it can be advantageous. Just kind of read into the bosses that you're doing or you want to do, and just see which one is better for you to use, whether it be the Ripper because of passive, Calgarian because of crit, or maybe an accuracy case, so you want to pull something like a knife. Blood Reaver, as far as I know, I haven't really used it at all. However, for something that is relatively high in rage or something you're finding very difficult, this can make life a little bit easier for learning's sake. However, I have not experimented too much with Blood Reaver. It's kind of a recent addition for me, and I'm still experimenting with it. So I just wanted to do kind of a final wrap-up of all of the information said in this video, as kind of a TLDR type thing. So, for magic damage, the main difference is whether or not you have FSOA, and that's going to change the type of rotation you do. Luckily, with magic, there's no in-between spec, so you don't have to really worry about what you're doing in between spec. I would say just focus on maybe getting a couple thresholds off, a G staff or so, and moving on from there, and then just focusing on which sun rotation is going to work for you. If you're able to learn Fortic and you want to go ahead and learn that, it is more than worthwhile to learn, and will teach you a lot more about this combat system than you could ever really realize until you learn it. As far as rotations go, without FSOA, so this is applicable to anywhere from the beginning weapons, the like T1 magic weapons, all the way up till full-on tier 92. If you have the Zuck Cape, focus on getting 2 Omni Powers, 2 Wild Magics, a Detonate, and an Fix Off during a Sunshine, and you'll be off to the races doing a lot of damage. If you have FSOA, follow it the typical FSOA rotation, being get Tsunami and the Staff spec done as quick as possible, and focus Tendies, then Wild Magic, or Omni Power, depending on what your Adrenaline situation's looking like, and then weave in the rest of the thresholds and Armadyl Battle Staff spec to your heart's content. The Metamorphosis, the rotation that I gave, is something niche that I just sort of came up with. I use it on the 3rd crystal of ED1. I use it at Solak P4, and there's a few different variations of the Solak 1. However, that's just the one that I've personally used. I use it Raksha P4 when I have all of the stacks built up, just to make sure I'm hitting those 16.8Ks on crits, and that's about it. And spell swapping, if you want to do it, it's really simple, and I would suggest using manual spellcast with it, so it makes using auto attacks with abilities easier and just keeps everything neat and tidy. And then if you have an FSOA, use Calgarian Demon. If you don't have an FSOA, probably use Ripper, and specific boss encounters might require you to use a Nihil, or you might want to pull out a Blood Reaver for some instances, or even the good old-fashioned Pac-Man. Anyways, ladies, gentlemen, and I did not forget about you, Seismic Singularities, thank you very much for watching this guide. There is a lot of information here, I know. However, it's pretty much everything I could think to get out there that is pertinent to magic damage. If you found this guide helpful at all, please consider subscribing to the channel. There are more guides to come. I have the range DPS guide to come out, and then I'll be moving into more boss-specific guides, and that'll be all coming out in the future. Ladies, gentlemen, Seismic Singularities, thank you for watching. This has been Car Guy. Have a wonderful morning, evening, afternoon, nighttime, whatever it is, wherever you are, and I will see you for the next guide or video. Peace.